Dear students, following this video, you can learn about errors in hypothesis testing. Okay, dear students, then when we are doing research, we are getting at last the research finding. But at the very beginning of the research, when we are doing the experiments, actually we don't know what is the results. Therefore, the results may be our expectation, or sometimes it is not our expectation. The researcher's expectation is the treatment should be significant, but we don't know. Sometimes we can get the treatments are not significant. Therefore, then that is called hypothesis. Then hypothesis mean assumptions. There are two assumptions when we are doing the research at very beginning. Then those assumptions may be the treatments are significant at last, or treatments are not significant. Like that, this hypothesis is a statement of expectation. What is our expectation? That may be researcher's expectation, or otherwise it is not the researcher's expectation. Or prediction, expectation, no, that is forecast. Then forecasting, the prediction that will be tested by research. Then we are testing what? We are testing the treatments. Then at last the treatment may be significant or not significant. According to that, there are two kinds of hypotheses. Then we will discuss those. Then as I told, there are two kinds of hypotheses. Then the first one is null hypothesis. It is denoted by H naught. Another one is alternative hypothesis, that is denoted by H1 or Hj. Then actually null hypothesis means there are no differences in the treatment. Then the results, there are no differences in the results. That means treatment means. But in the alternative hypothesis, there are some particular significance of the results or treatment means. There are some differences among the treatment means. That is the alternative hypothesis. Actually, we are doing some research to get this alternative hypothesis. That means there should have some particular differences in the treatment means. In out of all the treatment, which one is best, like that we are finding. Then actually in null hypothesis, it is telling there are no differences among the treatment means. Like that it is explaining. Actually we discuss, then if we are getting the null hypothesis, there is no differences in the treatment. Then actually hypothesis testing start with the assumption of no difference between treatments. Then that means treatments are equal. Treatment means are equal. No differences of the treatment means. Then therefore no relationship between variables in the population. Then we are checking the variables, but if we are checking the variables, we can't get the differences of variables in the population. There are no treatment effect. There are no differences of the treatment means, or it has no effect on the study. Then if we are getting example, we are checking the treatments of organic fertilizer versus inorganic fertilizer. Then we are getting inorganic fertilizer. That is the recommended by the Department of Agriculture. Then we are checking organic fertilizer, poultry manure, cattle manure, and compost. Like that you are checking organic manure. Then after doing the study, at last, then you are getting uh, the treatments are not significant. What is the meaning? There are no any differences among the treatments, and poultry manure is not showing any differences than the inorganic fertilizer, and also cattle manure and also compost. They are not showing any differences than the inorganic fertilizer. Therefore, the particular fertilizer we applied, particular organic fertilizer we applied is not showing any extra yield effect there. Then they are not showing high yield than the inorganic fertilizer applied. Like that, that is called null hypothesis. Then the meaning is you need to think further, then you need to improve the organic fertilizer, or you need to do the research in other way around and improving the organic fertilizer levels. Like that, some particular suggestions may be there with the particular research. That is the null hypothesis, because treatments are not significant here in the particular research. Then here in hypothesis testing, if you are getting the graphs, you can see, then this area is the null hypothesis accepted area. This area is the null hypothesis rejected area. That is called critical region. There are two critical regions here in the left side and the right side, you can see here. Always we express this hypothesis with the use of null hypothesis, not the use of alternative hypothesis. Therefore, if null hypothesis, if we need to accept, we have to express it in this way. That is the fail to reject null hypothesis. What is the meaning? Fail to reject null hypothesis. The meaning is accept null hypothesis. At the time we accept the null hypothesis, what will happen to the alternative hypothesis? Reject the alternative hypothesis. That's the thing you need to understand. Only one result may come. Both results we can't get. Then if null hypothesis fail to reject, we have to reject the alternative hypothesis. If we reject null hypothesis, we have to accept the alternative hypothesis. That's the thing you need to understand here. Then we'll go to the alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is the researcher's hypothesis. The meaning is there are differences among the treatments. Then now we can check which treatment is best, like that. Then researcher also expect to get that outcome actually. So it is called reject null hypothesis. We have to express with the use of null hypothesis. Then here we need to express it as we have to reject the null hypothesis. Reject null hypothesis means what? Accept the alternative hypothesis. The meaning is it has the differences in the applied treatments. That is the alternative hypothesis. Then therefore, mu not equal to mu naught. That means treatment means are not equal each other. That is the meaning of alternative hypothesis. Further, we'll see what are the differences of null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. In the null hypothesis, no relationship between two variables or between treatments. In the alternative hypothesis, there is a relationship between variables or between treatments. That is the difference of null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. Next one, if accept null hypothesis, the result is insignificant. The result is not significant. That means there are no differences in the treatment means. That means you need to reject what? If accept null hypothesis, you need to reject what? Alternative hypothesis. If reject null hypothesis, you need to accept alternative hypothesis. That means in the organic fertilizer versus inorganic fertilizer, in the alternative hypothesis, if the treatments are significant, you have to accept the alternative hypothesis. You need to reject the null hypothesis. That means at least one treatment, poultry manure or cattle manure or compost, has some good effect on the yield of the crop than the inorganic fertilizer. That is the meaning. That is our researcher's expectation. That's why he or she did that research. Then therefore, at last, what we need to do, we need to find which treatment is best. Like that, now we can find if the alternative hypothesis is okay. That's the thing you need to understand. Then we'll go to errors in hypothesis testing. The type 1 error and type 2 error. There are two types of errors in hypothesis testing. The first one is the type 1 error and the second one is the type 2 error. Type 1 error is called false positive conclusion. False positive conclusion. And type 2 error is called false negative conclusion. What are these errors? Then errors in hypothesis testing, we will see type 1 error. Type 1 error is if the null hypothesis is true, but we reject it. Even though null hypothesis is true, we reject it. That is called type 1 error. Actually, that is error. Why? Null hypothesis is true, but we reject it. At the time, what will happen to the alternative hypothesis? We accept the alternative hypothesis even though it is wrong, like that. Okay, therefore it is a great error. Then what we need to do, actually we need to minimize these errors. Then we'll see the type 2 error. If the null hypothesis is false, we accept it. Actually null hypothesis is not correct. Alternative hypothesis is the correct one. But even though null hypothesis is false, we accept it as correct. That is the type 2 error. Don't get confused. Then the first one, null hypothesis is true, but we reject it. Then type 2 error, null hypothesis is false, but we accept it. Then what you need to understand here, type 1 error, reject it. Type 2 error, accept it. What is it? Null hypothesis. Type 1 error, reject null hypothesis. Type 2 error, accept null hypothesis. Then type 1 error, reject null hypothesis. Reject null hypothesis even though it is true. Then type 2 error, we accept null hypothesis even though it is false. Okay, likewise you need to remember what is the type 1 error and the type 2 error. Now we learned about type 1 error. We all know even though the null hypothesis is true, we reject it. That is the type 1 error. Then we'll get one example and we'll understand that. Then we'll see here Then type 1 error. How can happen the type 1 error? Then null hypothesis is true. That's the actual thing. Here mentioned actual thing. Null hypothesis is true. But this is the false thing. We reject null hypothesis. This is called type 1 error. If the null hypothesis is false, we need to reject null hypothesis. That is correct. But if the null hypothesis is true, we need to accept null hypothesis. But error is the rejecting the null hypothesis. That is called type 1 error. Here we can see then type 1 error. HO is true. That means null hypothesis is true. We need to accept null hypothesis. That is correct decision. Then if the null hypothesis is false, even if we are accepting the null hypothesis, that is called type 2 error. Then if the null hypothesis is true, we reject the null hypothesis. That is called type 1 error. That is called alpha. The amount of error is the alpha. Then if it is correct, 1 minus alpha. Then if we said the error is 5%, then correct decision is the 95%. Like that. We have to remember that. Then the type 1 error. Actually, this is essentially means that unexpected outcomes or alternative hypothesis can be true. That is, unexpected outcome is that when we reject the null hypothesis, we need to accept the alternative hypothesis. But alternative hypothesis is not true. But we accept it as true. That is the great error, no? Great error. Thus, it is recommended that one should aim to keep type 1 errors as small as possible. Then what we need to do? Then all the experimental errors, it is very difficult to reduce or minimize. We need to minimize it, but it is very difficult to remove it. Therefore, what we need to do actually, we need to reduce this type 1 error as small as possible. That's the thing we can do. Then actually, in order to achieve the lower type 1 error, the hypothesis testing assigned a fairly small value to the significance level, then probability level. Then common values for the significant level are 0.05 and 0.01. Although an average, normally we are getting 0.05. That means 5% errors are there. There is possibility to happen 5% errors. That is the 0.05. Then 95% correct. That is the meaning. Then 0.01 means there is possibility to happen the error 99%. 99%. That's the thing mentioned here. Then we see the graph. Then here, then error. Alpha mean type 1 error. Then error set 0.05. That means 5% is the error. Then 95% correct, no? Then error we set only to 5%. Then 2.5 for the left side and 2.5 for the right side. Like that, minimize this error. Then if it is higher than 5%, that is high error. Then always we need to minimize the errors. It is better if we can set the alpha 0.01, but normally in the research, normally we set 5% alpha level. Then we'll go to one example about the type 1 error. House is on fire. House is on fire. Why we are guessing that? Then we need to guess whether the house is on fire or not. We can guess the house is on fire because smokes are coming from the house. Or otherwise, uh, smokes are coming from the kitchen if you are cooking some particular food. Then we can guess sometimes the house is on fire, or inside of house they are cooking some particular food. Those are the two outcomes that can come. Then we'll go how can happen this type 1 error. Let's take example of smoking coming out of a house. There are two possibilities. Either the smoke is due to some sort of food getting cooking, or alternatively the house is on fire. Let's state the null hypothesis, H naught, that the house is not on the fire. The smoke is coming due to food getting cooked. Okay. Now we are thinking then null hypothesis we said house is not on fire but due to some food cooking inside of the house. That is the null hypothesis. Then we'll analyze this type 1 error. The person is passing by rejected the null hypothesis that the smoke is due to the food getting cooked and called the firefighters. Then we reject. Then actually it is correct, but we reject it. The person passing through the house then think that is not the smoke coming from the cooking food, and he may think that is due to house on fire. Then he may call to firefighters. Firefighters. Then what will happen? However, in reality, the reality is what? Actually, null hypothesis is correct. Actually, this smoke is due to the food being cooked and house was not on fire. But wrongly decided house is on fire and called the firefighters. Thus, the person incorrectly or falsely reject the null hypothesis, or the person raised the false alarm. Then cases like these are also termed false positive. False positive. The things false, they are getting as positive. In other words, the person made a type 1 error. Person made a type 1 error. Now you all know about the type 1 error. Then we'll go to the type 2 error. Then if the null hypothesis is false, but we accept it. It is false, but accept it. That is called type 2 error. That is also not good, no? That is also not good because null hypothesis is false, no? But we accept it. Then we'll go to one example. One fails to reject the null hypothesis when he should actually have rejected it. This error or mistake is termed as type 2 error. Actually, we need to reject the null hypothesis, but we accept it. That is the type 2 error. Then we'll get one example. Null hypothesis we set here as Mr. Pereira did the crime. Then alternative hypothesis is then Mr. Pereira did not do the crime. Then type 2 error means fail to reject null hypothesis. Fail to reject null hypothesis. That means we accept null hypothesis. We accept null hypothesis. Then what will happen? Accept null hypothesis, but it is not correct. Then Mr. Pereira did the crime. Then actually get the results, fail to reject null hypothesis. Actually, we accept Mr. Pereira did the crime, but actually Mr. Pereira didn't do the crime. Then he may go to jail. He may go to jail because of this false result. He may go to the jail. Mr. Pereira did not do the crime, but we accept only null hypothesis, not the alternative hypothesis. Then accept null hypothesis, but actually it is not correct. This is called the type 2 error. Even though he is correct, it is not accepted. That means actually Mr. Pereira did not do the crime, but accepted as he did the crime. Like that. That is wrongly measured. Therefore, type 2 error also in this case, it is not good. Then we need to minimize this type 2 error also. Then that is beta. Then here 1 minus beta is the not error. If the beta is high, what will happen? The correctness will be very low. That's the thing about the type 2 error. We'll see here how we can get the type 2 error. Actually, null hypothesis is true. If the null hypothesis is true, we need to accept the null hypothesis. That is correct. But here what is happening in type 2 error? Null hypothesis is false. But we accept it. Fail to reject null hypothesis. That means we accept null hypothesis. That is the type 2 error, or it is called what? Beta error. Beta error. Here, beta error. As a summary, you need to know only these two actually. I explain more. But if you know these two, that is enough. Actually, type 1 error is if the null hypothesis is true, but we reject it. Rejecting the null hypothesis even though it is true. Rejecting. Then type 2 error, if the null hypothesis is false, we accept it. Accepting the null hypothesis even though it is not correct. It is false. Even though it is false, we accept it. Then you need to learn the two terms. Type 1 error, reject null hypothesis. Type 2 error, accept null hypothesis or fail to reject null hypothesis. Those are the two terms you need to learn well. Then I think you understood what are the errors in hypothesis testing. And next lecture we'll do the what are the steps in hypothesis testing. That is the last lecture. We'll learn from next video that. Then we'll meet from the